Oh, you all sound pretty energetic, like you got an extra day off there. A little feedback. I came in for the landing hot this morning. Wow, so we have been, for the last weeks now, talking about relationships, talking about marriage. And so I have a confession to make. Today is, it's not specifically about marriage. But I want to talk about something that I think you need to apply in marriage. And I think by the time we're done, we'll have put it all together. Because I want to talk this weekend about how wounds happen, and then how they heal, and maybe a little bit of how we can help in that process, how they happen, how they heal, and then how we can help. But that's not actually the outline. I just hope that when we're done, we have accomplished that. Because here's what we know. We know that all of us, every single one of us in this room, have wounds in our lives. And those wounds, they form who we are and how we function. They form us, and sometimes, if we're being honest, they warp us into the person that we are, and they affect our lives, our relationships, and yes, our marriages. And so, I want to take a little bit of time to talk about how it is that these things that have been so instrumental in forming who you are, and maybe who your spouse is, and how your marriage functions, how they can heal, and how we can help. To do that, I want to turn to the book of 2 Timothy chapter 4, to a passage I'm not sure that we've ever spent any time or length of time looking at, and so maybe a little bit of context would be helpful. 2 Timothy is actually the very last book that Paul writes. And chapter 4 is the last chapter, and we're going to read some of the last verses. So what you are reading is some of the very last things that the Apostle Paul, who wrote the bulk of the New Testament and was maybe the greatest Christian leader our world has ever seen. I consider Jesus Christ a founder and something far beyond just a leader of a movement, but as a leader who took up that mantle and gave us a framework and how to understand what Jesus came to do and what he wanted us to do. Paul gave it to us, and here we are in 2 Timothy chapter 4, and we're reading his final words, and those words are couched in a letter he has written to Timothy, who is a young leader, a protege, and obviously there's a second, so there's a first, and this is the second of two books that he's written to him, and he's giving him an outline, and there's a little bit of context that you'll need to fully appreciate what you're about to read, because we're only going to read two verses, and they're very short, but context would be helpful. So we know that in Paul's life, there came a point where his preaching and teaching was so controversial, and the movement of Christ across the world was moving so rapidly and spreading so much that the religious leaders of the day in Caesarea had him arrested. And when he was arrested, it was about 57 AD. He was arrested, and because he was a Roman citizenship, he had dual citizenship, he appealed to Rome, and they had to send him to Rome. Now, leaving Israel and going up to Rome was a big deal, because Rome was the center of the world. It was the power seat. It was where everything that was anything was happening. And Paul is now, from 57 for about 5 years until about 62 AD, Paul is imprisoned in Rome. And ultimately, and we're piecing together bits and pieces of the story from the Bible and from historians who are writing contemporaneously, we know that about 5 years later, because his accusers never made the journey to Rome to formally finalize the accusations, it seems, he was released. But while he was in prison, he wrote those prison epistles. That's why we call them prison epistles. They were the letters he wrote from prison to other leaders. And then in 64 AD, something happens. In 64 AD, if you may remember from your high school history class, Rome burned, or a good portion of Rome burned down. Remember, that was the whole Nero fiddles while Rome burns. And you may remember that Nero decided to pin the burning of Rome on Christians. This was likely an effort to divert from the fact that he had done it himself to rebuild portions he wanted to rebuild, but that's a separate history story, and it doesn't really matter. He pinned it on Christians, and during that time, 64 AD, Paul is arrested again. It's his second imprisonment, and this one would ultimately end in his death a year later. History tells us, what's come down to us by tradition, is that he was beheaded in 65 AD. But during that final year he's in prison, he writes this letter, 2 Timothy, to his young protege in the faith. And when you get to chapter 4, he mentions something. He just references it. But in these quick verses, you get that it is dripping with emotion. Because by this point, Paul has already gone for what we would call a pre-trial hearing. He has gone to court where his accusers would accuse him, and those who could defend him would defend him, and they would determine if this was actually a just cause to go forward with. And with all of that as background, we come to 2 Timothy chapter 4 in verse 16, and we uncover something I think that will help us this morning. Here's what he says. He says, the first time I was brought before the judge, that's that pre-trial hearing. The first time I was brought before the judge, no one came with me. And we discover that in the midst of his second imprisonment, in a city that was full of underground church believers, to the very people he had written his most famous book, the book of Romans, to the people he had given the last 5 years of his life, 6 years of his life to. When he went to court, he said, I went to trial, I stood before the judge, and no one. And in fact, he then follows with another sentence. He says, everyone abandoned me. The first seems like a statement of fact. No one stood with me. But then as if he wanted to understand how this felt, he adds in this idea that while I was standing there and looking around and realizing that I had given my life to these people and no one was there, and he said, and I realized everyone had abandoned me. You can feel the emotion and the disappointment dripping off of these verses. But in one swift verse, Paul is not quite done, because he goes on to say, may it not be counted against them. You catch that the hurt, the memory of what had happened is real. But in this one statement, may it not. I was all alone in my hour of need. I was desperate for someone, just anyone, to stand up and say, this isn't true. This man's not responsible for this crime. And no one was there, and everyone abandoned me. And then he says, may it not be counted against them. It's almost like Paul, in the midst of his disappointment and looking at the wound in his life, recognizes that these are dangerous times, and this city is flowing with fear as people are hunting down Christians, as the leaders have accused them. And I wish anyone would have stood with me. And he takes that wound, that that searing disappointment, and he fills it in with something. He fills it in with grace, with forgiveness. And in doing so, this wound becomes something different than a wound. The wound becomes a scar. Here's my guess. Everyone in the room has a scar. And afterwards, out on the patio, drinking some apple cider, we can show our scars. The appropriate ones, all right? Just like, don't get too careful. If it's too, we don't want to, right? But like I could show you, I could say, I've got a scar right here behind my eye. When I was like kindergarten, first grade, I was running on the playground. I was running from a kid who I was afraid of, and I was running across the playground. I had a pencil in my hand, and I fell. And it went into my eye, and the lead broke off in the muscle behind the eye. It was terrifying. It's every bit as ugly as it sounded. But everything turned out. It didn't go in. It went around. It went into the muscle, and they did this surgery, and they got all the lead out, and I can see fine, and I've got this little scar. There's a story that goes with the scar. I've got a big one here. I've got, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, I had this giant growth. It was like they were nervous for about a week, like, what is this? And I went into the hospital. It turned out just to be this really weird abscess, and they took it out. But literally, I was preaching every Sunday with this like enormous thing sticking off the side of my head, and people were like, "Whoa, you need to get that looked at." And I did, and they took it out, and they were really good. And so it's like in the crease. They like put the scar in the crease. Isn't it funny how when we have a scar, there's a story that goes with the scar. And isn't it funny how we like to tell the story? Like, we're like, oh, look at this one right here. I've actually got this little one on my hand. Like this, it's right here. That's the easiest one to show you. Like, and here's the thing, it's like a nothing scar. I'm like, how? Like, I was playing basketball and somebody reached, and it was just like their fingernail scraped me. It was like it was just like this tiny little thing. And I don't know if it just happened wrong, or I picked the scab, or I don't know, but it ended up in this little scar on my hand. Of all the things that have happened in my life, I've got this, like, the most notable scar I've got is like right there, and it's like from nothing. Like, how does that happen? But in all of this story, I think the thing that we recognize is that there's a story behind the scar, and the scar started out as a wound in our life, but the wound got filled in with something, and the wound became a scar. And here's what we can agree on. A scar is better than a wound. That's where I just want to settle for a moment. A scar is better than a wound. It's been filled in with something, and it's why. Listen, we don't walk around going, oh, hey, look at my wound, and we peel back the gauze pad. It's like, whoa, I don't want to see that, because it's like too much information. It's kind of gross. But like your scar, we're like, oh, that's kind of cool. But the wound, and there's something about that thing that has gone through a process of healing, and the wound has been filled in and has become a scar. And here's how you'll know. Because you can touch a scar, and it doesn't ooze, and it doesn't hurt. But that wound, as soon as you touch it, it's oozing, and it's painful. See, you've got stuff in your life that you've been claiming was a scar, but it's not a scar. It's still a wound, because we've been picking, and it's been a decade, 20, 30, 40 years, and it's a part of your life, and it's never healed. It's never been filled in. And the reason you can tell is that you can't touch it. You can't talk about it. Every time you go to it, it just oozes pain and agony and bitterness. It's like emotional pus is like coming out of it, because it's still a wound that's never been healed. And this is what this passage, here's what Paul is doing. Paul is showing us how this works. He's saying, look at, like this was a painful moment. Like, I spent my entire life giving myself to this cause. I had poured my life into these people. And I stood up there, and not one of them showed up. Not one of them. And then he says, may it not be counted against them. He fills that wound with the grace of forgiveness. He takes that big, broken, open place and he just pours grace and forgiveness into it, and it fills it up, and it becomes a scar that we can touch and we can learn from. The story of it is still there, but it's been healed, and it's been healed by forgiveness. You see, forgiveness is both the sign that we have healed, and it's how we heal. Forgiveness is a sign that God has done or is doing his work in us, but it's also the way he does his work in us. It's the thing that we take, and in that broken place where there's fear and there's anger and there's bitterness, we pour it into us. And some of us, and here's the struggle, some of us are waiting for someone else to pour and fix the wound for us. Someone who's offended you, someone who's hurt you, someone who's abandoned you, someone who wasn't there when they were supposed to be there, and it's been 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and the wound is still open because you're waiting for them to do what they're supposed to do, and I'm here to tell you, they may never do it. And you don't have to wait, because you can fill that wound. You can go to that place of brokenness, and that empty space that needs to be filled, you can just begin to fill it with the grace of forgiveness, undeserved mercy. For a person who may have forgotten long ago that they even hurt you, or maybe has passed off into eternity, or a person who despises you or doesn't want to help you, or rejects the idea that they even hurt you, you can fill that wound with the grace of forgiveness, and that wound becomes over time a scar, and the sign is that you'll be able to touch it and talk about it, because the grace of forgiveness has begun to heal it. Some of you are, you're looking, going, oh, Pat, this is like a live wire. You're touching on like heavy, heavy, heavy stuff. And you don't understand, like this is, I can't. And I want to take and talk a little bit, because I know this is hard. This is so hard, and here's where I want us to finish, because this healing that we're talking about, this healing requires help. It requires help. Like you can't get it done yourself. It requires help. Like that person may never come back, but you need help. And actually, the next verse actually speaks to that, and it talks about this help, because the heroic work of restoration in your life, of healing that wound, that thing that's just been festering and oozing and just keeps popping up, and the scab keeps getting ripped off, that thing to get it healed, that it's heroic, it's restoration, it's the rebuilding of who you are, it's complete transformation. And none of us can do it on our own. Here's what verse 17 says. Paul says, I stood by myself. No one stood with me. They abandoned me, but God and people, don't hold it against them. Don't hold it against them. And then he says this, but the Lord stood with me. The Lord stood with me, like his presence was visible and tangible. On that day when I thought everybody else had abandoned me, I realized I was not alone. The Lord stood with me, and he gave me strength so that I might preach the good news in its entirety for all the Gentiles to hear. And he rescued me from certain death. And I think here Paul is speaking about spiritual death. I think he's saying, listen, no matter what happens to me here, God's got this story covered. But I just want to camp there. The Lord stood with me. The Lord stood by myself. Listen, Paul came to this story, these 2 short verses, and he's hoping for help. He's wishing there was somebody, anybody, that would have just showed up at court that day and said, this man is innocent. But he gets it, and nobody did. And he says, the Lord stood with me. I imagine years later, as this letter became part of the original canon of the church, and it started spreading, and it would be read aloud in the church, including the church at Rome. I imagine some of the people hearing that story read, they get to the end of chapter 4, and Paul says, no one stood with me. Everyone abandoned me. I imagine when they read that aloud in the church, it got quiet. And heads were hung a little bit low. Man, someone should have gone. I wished I'd gone. He shouldn't have had to stand by himself. How does that happen? Paul. And Paul is saying, but I wasn't alone. God stood with me. But we shouldn't miss the point that there was an opportunity here for those who could have been there but weren't there. So let me try and apply this to marriage. I've talked over the years a fair bit. That's kind of my approach to preaching and teaching, is that I share, I try and share our lives as transparently as is appropriate and as I can. And God is just, his blessing and favor has been on Tammy and I's life, and we're just so grateful, but you've also heard me talk about it wasn't always, it was, in fact, there was an early season of our marriage that was just, it was ugly. And if you really want to understand what was happening in the early years for Ben and Tammy Feldott, you'd have to go back to when Tammy was 14 years old, and her parents were divorced. Divorce, the best of divorces, create an uncertainty and a trauma in the lives of children. Teenagers forming their lives, trying to figure it out. In the worst of cases, the trauma just runs just like it's life bone deep. I would meet her 4 years later in college, and 4 years later we were married. But when she was 14, she walked through this season of trauma, and she met the trauma like any teenager would, with some fear, and then with boldness and with anger. And then I met her 4 years later, and then 4 years later after that we were married. And I knew what she had gone through. I knew her parents and the story there. But honestly, for me, it was just history. It was just past history. That's something that happened to you 4 years, 8 years ago. It's done. It's history. And I think that's how she thought too. And then we got married. And something about marriage just triggered it. That fear, that view of what happens in homes and happens in marriages and happens with husbands came back. And it manifested itself in anger. And we spent the first 5, 6, 7 years in our marriage we were on the rocks, folks. I'll remind you, we were starting a church during this time. We started church in 9 months. That's crazy. It's not good advice, but we did 9 months after we got married, and we're like planting a church, and we're figuring this out, and we're at home, and we're going head to head. And I'm like, who's this angry person I married? Where did this come from? Because I didn't know this person we were in Bible. Because I didn't know this person when we were dating. Like this, where did this come from? And what I didn't know, what she didn't know, is that when we walked into this relationship, there was a wound in her life. There was an open wound, and it hadn't been filled. Those of you who know my wife know she's kind of like, people, like when I tell this story, people think I'm lying because she's like the nicest, kindest person you've ever met. And you're like, anger? Like, I could see Ben being angry, like, no problem. Like, I've seen that. And there came a point about, 6 or 7 years into it, where she just decided, I'm not going to be this person. There's something happening in me that God didn't put there but God can fix. And she began this heroic journey towards restoration. And she would look at the anger and then look at the wound, and she began to fill it with the grace of forgiveness. And I did nothing. I had grown up and received a faith that taught me to respond to people's struggle with righteous indignation. Why are you like this? I don't deserve this. You should fix that. And while she's walking this heroic journey, I'm responding to anger and hurt with anger. A few weeks ago, I told the story of the Gardner Museum and that upper floor with the masters in it and those blank frames that have been ripped out where the paintings have been stolen. And I likened it to those places in our life where something's been ripped out. I got to the end of that, and every time I talk about that, I get emotional, and the reason I do is because it's me. Because my wife was in that room with those broken, ripped out paintings. And I was walking by that room and saying, hey, close the door. I'm not going in there. I don't like that room. I didn't buy that room. And she's sitting in that room just figuring it out, pouring in the grace of forgiveness into the wound that had happened. And meanwhile, the one person who should have stood with her wasn't. But God stood with her and began this heroic work. Tammy and I have been leading the marriage class, and we've been doing it along with 100 or so other couples. And so we've been talking, and we've had a few chances to just sit and talk about this the last few weeks and just that whole journey. And now we can look back because the wound became a scar, and we can touch it. And we can look. But with some sadness. So I want to finish just by giving you 3 lessons that I've taken from those conversations, lessons that I would just put in your lap. If someone in your life has a wound and they're struggling with it. So here's the first lesson. Don't give up and don't give in. Those are 2 separate things. Don't give up, don't give in. Here's what I mean. If I did one thing that was halfway right, I didn't leave. In fact, my famous line to Tammy was, hey, you're stuck with me. Like if I learned anything, I'm just not going anywhere. Like, you're stuck with me. And honestly, it wasn't always like the best thing to say, because there were moments where she was like, I would rather not be stuck with you. Like, if you don't want to come into this room, just leave. But I didn't. I didn't know where else to go. I was like, this is what I'm supposed to do. And don't give up, don't give in. Don't give in to temptation. Listen, at your darkest hour, ruinous temptation is going to come into your life. Someone's going to walk around and they're going to say the right thing to you, and they're going to bat their eyes at you right, and they're going to be able to do something, and you're going to be tempted, and you are going to ruin everything. The chance you had to fill in that wound will be ruined. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't give up. Don't give in. Here is a second thought. I'll make sure I say it right so it's the same as on the screen. Look behind the door. Look behind the door. Listen, that room, I don't know, you guys, listen, let me just start guy to guy. Like some of you are like, I don't do emotion. I get it. Like I grew up like, nope, no emotion. Like the only emotion some of us do is anger. And you don't even know what to do in that room. Like your wife or your husband is sitting in that room and it's dark and you're like, you think you're doing the best thing you can do is not go in the room, and I'm telling you it's not the best thing you can do. You don't even have to know what to say. Listen, that room has seats for two. If you've got someone in your life that is sitting in that room and just trying to figure out how to fill that wound, if you can do nothing else, I'm just saying, walk into that room, sit down. Just sit for a while. Just sit there. Just be with them. And if you see them doing a little bit of just heroic work, if you just see them wrestling and trying to figure it out and asking questions, let them know you admire them. If you got nothing else, just let them know, hey, honey, I don't know how to fix that, but my goodness, you're strong. Just keep going. Keep going. And then last, fill every wound. It turns out there's like one medicine that works. Fill every wound with the grace of forgiveness. And if the faith that you have received and you have grown into doesn't furnish you with an abundance of the grace of forgiveness, then you need to do what I did and go back and take a fresh look at your faith. Because what it was meant to do was to fill you with so much grace that God has poured into your life that it just can't help but overflow into the lives of others. And if your faith has given you just an overwhelming amount of righteous indignation, take a fresh look at your faith. There's more. It was meant for more. Just go back and take every wound. Just start pouring the grace of forgiveness. Let me say one last thing. It's not in the notes. Some of you, you're sitting here or you're watching online, and this hurts because you're alone. Someone left you. You were sitting in that room and they just decided, I'm done. I'm done. And you're walking through this alone. And you wish more than anything there were someone who could just stand with you. Let me just tell you this. The most heroic woman I know went in that room alone. But she wasn't alone. God just did a work. See, we all have a room, every one of us. And even if no one else is with you, God stands with you. Would you bow your heads with me? I want to pray for those who maybe this morning have a wound that hasn't healed. And maybe you feel all alone. God is about to do His greatest work. And when we stand with Him, when we go to that place of brokenness, He gives us the grace to fill it with forgiveness in ways that set us free forever. And the wound becomes a scar, and it becomes a story of God's goodness and His grace. Father, I pray for those who are just here and their hearts are heavy. They're just wrestling through this, trying to figure it out. And at times we've felt just like Paul. No one stood with me. Everyone abandoned me. But God stood with me. God stood with me. So let those who are struggling by themselves sense the presence of God like they've never sensed it before. Would you lift them up in this work of restoration, Father, and do something in them that no one else could do, Father? Would you restore? Would you rebuild? Would you heal that wound and fill it in with the grace of forgiveness in a way that is supernatural and healing and becomes a story, and certainly a scar, but it's a story of God's grace. And for those of us who have someone in our life, a husband, a wife, a son or a daughter, a mother, a father, a friend, and we know they're struggling. Father, we want to walk into that room. We want to look behind that door. We want to sit with them. If nothing else, to say, I'm here, man. I'm here. So, Father, give us the wisdom to see when people are hurting and not just see when they're angry, Father. Give us the wisdom to know when to walk in and to when to sit down and just to be a presence in their life, a presence of grace and mercy and forgiveness. And, Father, transform us. Put in us a faith that is not full of righteous indignation for people who struggle, but Father, is full of grace and mercy, the same grace and mercy that overflowed into our life. Let it overflow into others' lives. May our marriages be known for this. In Jesus' name, amen.